What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and, well, for those that already don't know, my channel may have a lot of things all over the place. Considering how I more or less started this channel as a sort of countdown creator, it basically focuses on things that kind of that I want to make videos of. Specifically countdowns of. However, one of two franchises tend to come up more often than not, that being Pokemon and Fire Emblem, since those are my two favorite franchises. And while I did focus on top 10 favorite Pokemon types, I've never really done a top 10 favorite Fire Emblem classes, so honestly, what better time than the present to make something like this? So, that being said, it's time to count down the top 10 and my top 10 favorite Fire Emblem classes. And in all fairness, I'm at least taking a look at classes that have been in at least 2 or maybe 3 games. And this does depend on whether they've been under another name or something, but if they're more or less similar to each other, then it honestly makes sense. Or in this case, they're going to be considered for this list. So, without further ado, let's get started. Starting off first at number 10, we have Halberdier. A wise man once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Granted, one would say that Teddy Roosevelt may have been talking about a club, but in all fairness, in this case, he could have been talking about a spear, and it would have equally had a lot of weight around that time. But that being said, I think those words really come poignant when it comes down to the Halberdier class. And it really says a lot once you realize that the soldiers are the main, I guess I'd say, foot mobs of the Fire Emblem franchise, as you tend to see them all over the place, yet you've never had a chance to control them. In fact, the soldier class has only been playable in 2 games, those being Gaiden and of course their sequel Echoes and Path of Radiance. Well, specifically 3 when you think about it. But even with that, the soldier class, the Halberdier class really stands the test of time. As while knights and generals are basically just huge, unpassable walls, Halberdiers are equally as defensive, but they tend to do a solid amount of damage. Basically, they're just your poking. They basically are the perfect units to more or less poke an opponent and more or less defeat them. And even with that, I tend to have a lot of favorite units that I enjoy from this class. I mean, we do have the character of Oboro, who basically is Hoshido's answer to the Halberdier class, being a spear fighter / spearmaster. And even with Fire Emblem Engage giving us Tamara as one of the best spear or lance units in the game, or the best royal in the game, considering her ability, how busted her skill Sandstorm is. But that being said, honestly, I have to go with Nephany. And granted, I've played through Path of Radiance like 2 or 3 times. And each time I've played through it, I've always ended up finding it. I've always ended up using Nephany and enjoying every single moment of it. And as much as Oboro and Tamara are kind of my favorites for obvious reasons, Nephany, there's something about Nephany that just stands the test of time. And honestly, it really does fit her idea, as she's basically a former, I believe, Benyon soldier. She's a former Benyon soldier who more or less ended up as part of the Benyon army, but is shy at the same time. Is shy of the fact that she's basically from the countryside, and it's kind of her way of. She's kind of afraid of showing that part of her personality. And over time, you see her more or less coming out of her shell, which is really perfect to say the least. So, yeah. Halberdier for the win. Moving on next, at number 9, we have the Trickster class. Yeah. Honestly, considering how I was first introduced to the Fire Emblem franchise with Blazing Sword, the very first game I actually owned owned a physical copy of, was Awakening. So I mostly cut my teeth on this franchise through that game in particular. So more often than not, many of these classes I enjoy courtesy of Awakening. That being said, considering how Awakening introduced the Trickster class, yeah, it's really become one of my favorites, since it's a class that utilizes both swords and magic, basically becoming a jack of all trades. And it's one I really enjoyed using in Fire Emblem Awakening. That being said, it did get replaced eventually as some of my favorites. Naturally, because of, I played games where the Trickster class didn't show up. I mean, heck, in Echoes, it's kind of outright replaced with the Priestess class. And it's only used for female mages, so there's that. However, it wasn't until I ended up playing through Three Houses' DLC, the DLC for Three Houses, that I realized, holy crap, I can understand I remember why I liked the Trickster class in the first place. And honestly, the fact that they brought the Trickster class back after all that time, but adding in a new, I guess I say a new trick, pardon the pun, up their sleeves in the form of foul play, which, for those that don't know what I'm talking about, watch Bizmix's video about Cinder Xiao's DLC, where at the end he basically says foul play was cool, And honestly, I can understand I can understand that, as foul play allows you to switch spaces with another unit. So, yeah, it's basically the swap card. It's basically the swap spell card of Fire Emblem. And that being said, in terms of my favorite trickster, if you hadn't already guessed in terms of 3 houses, it has to be Yuri. I mean, granted, if we go with tricksters as a whole, Anna would basically be the favorite for the longest time since... However, basically, while Anna does show how good she is as a trickster, it's Yuri that basically holds that title non-stop. And basically, his entire backstory proves him to be perfect as a trickster. And honestly, I don't know what else to say, but but if I do play through 3 houses, you know I'm gonna use Yuri. Just that much is true. Moving on next, at number 8, we have Bow Knight. Speaking of classes that tend to essentially hold my interest courtesy of 3 houses, yeah, the Bow Knight class is basically one of those classes that really tend to essentially interest me. And as many of you guys know, I am a sucker for archers. As it's one thing as when anyone utilizes a bow and arrow in battle, I will more or less gravitate towards it like you wouldn't believe. And that being said, the Bow Knight class is That being said, the Bow Knight class in Fire Emblem has had so many iterations showing up in the game. It has had so many iterations in the game that I was more or less considering including them. These including the Nomads and Nomad Troopers from the Alib duology, the Ranger class from Sacred Stones, the Horseman class from the Arcanea duology, and yeah, oddly enough, this is... and heck, even the Cupido, again, still do not know how to pronounce that, but Fogato's personal class in Engage. Which, honestly, considering I had that much to go on, yeah, basically, it serves 2 of my favorite. It serves something that I'm enjoying, as it's basically a bow unit, but mounted on a horse, and usually wielding a sword for melee attacks. So yeah, I tend to have one of these on my team no matter what. That being said, makes you wonder what my favorite Bow Knight is. And while I would consider Fogato for the sheer fact that he's basically voiced by Zeno Robinson, aka the voice of Go from Pokemon Journeys, the series, so I cannot hear Fogato without hearing Go. But there's also the likes of Wrath from Blazing Sword, Astrid from the Teleus duology, Wolf from Shadow Dragon, or maybe even Warren from New Mystery, and even Leone from and even Leonie from Three Houses. However, if I had to choose my favorite, it has to be Nina from Fire Emblem Fates. And honestly, that really says a lot. And for those that are wondering where are the other ones involving Fire Emblem, my favorite Fire Emblem Fates characters, that is coming. I have to play through Fire Emblem Fates Conquest and Revelation in order to make those videos the best that I can. But anyway, either way, Nina is basically more or less going to be considered for the child units in Fire Emblem Fates, its countdown. Because honestly, Nina's entire story is kind of interesting, as she's basically robbing the rich and giving to the poor. And just giving back to the poor. Kind of like Fire Emblem's answer to Robin Hood. But, more or less obsessed with Yuri relationships. As in, guy. But, other than that, Nina's entire personality adds on the aspect of her just being a standard teenage girl. And, I mean, heck, even with that, every time I see Nina, I kind of see Lindsay Lohan's character from Freaky Friday. So yeah, it's kind of... And now that I'm thinking about that, I want to make a Fire Emblem and modern AU Fire Emblem fanfiction, where it's Fire Emblem Fates fanfiction, where it's basically just Freaky Friday. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Moving on, next at number 7, we have the Grappler class. Alright. When you think of the Fire Emblem, what's the first thing you think of when you think of combat? Like, a standard weapon like swords, lances, or axes? Maybe bows? A bit of magic? Yeah, those are normally the things that many of us would think of. But honestly, I know I'm not the only one that was more or less surprised when we discovered that in Three Houses, we'd get a class that would basically just allow you to throw hands. And honestly, it's very fair to say that the Grappler class really stood the test of time. Because they basically came back in Fire Emblem Engage, but under the new name of Martial Monk and Martial Master. Which, yeah, it's even crazier that they also added in healing magic. But they still add in that same amazing flavor of just punching and kicking the ever-loving snot out of your opponents. And basically, in this case, the Grappler, many of those involving the Grappler class, basically serve as a sort of, I guess I'd say, a glass cannon of sorts. As in, they're able to deal a lot of damage, but they're not able to take a lot of hits. It's kind of the whole thing, like, they're willing to fight, and while they are able to take some damage, they're basically kind of like, I didn't hear no bell. Oh my god. Which, that being said, in terms of my favorite grappler, or martial monk, or martial master, or brawler, a few have tended to stand out. Again, Again, case in point with characters like Raphael or Fram, who are basically kind of interesting in characters in terms of how their class, in terms of the class is in general. With Fram being more or less the excitable little twin to her brother Clan, and Raphael just being a big old beefy boy who loves to eat. However, I gotta go with Caspar. I mean, Caspar is basically just, well, he's your standard shonen hero, but he's basically just your standard punch first, ask questions never sort of character. And honestly, you gotta admit, it's just kind of refreshing to see this sort of character. Also, he gets into a lot of hilarious situations, which just makes me laugh as a result. Plus, considering many of the supports, Caspar is just a head empty sort of character who more or less, well, he's just a big dumb animal. Let's just leave it at that. And while a lot of people do tend to make Caspar like a warrior or an axe-wielding class, the one thing that comes to mind is that Grappler or War Master is always the way to go, because basically, punching is Caspar's lifeblood. Yeah. Moving on next at number 6, we have the Assassin class. Yeah. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of it all. And oh man. Honestly, considering how, like everyone else, I started getting into Fire Emblem with Blazing Sword, oh boy. It's very fair to say that the Assassin class introduced the Assassin class was introduced with a sort of grandiosity, yet mysterious flair that honestly many of us have essentially enjoyed. And that's really saying a lot, as they're not only incredibly fast, but they're able to deal chip damage to any opponent as a case of, well, death by 1,000 cuts. But the biggest one always comes courtesy of one thing: lethality. Yeah. It comes with the iconic insta-kill skill, lethality, which back during GBA Fire Emblem was originally known as Assassinate. And it definitely proves one thing, as the Assassin class implies that they're basically just cold, hard murderers. And honestly, they see it as business. And that's kind of the best thing about them, as they are uber serious about that. And while Fates did kind of replace the thief and assassin class with the ninja and outlaw class, they do have some characters that basically just showcase this perfectly, as seen with Saizo. And whereas as for the more recent entries, we do have the likes of characters like Yunaka and Zelkov from Engage, or even Petra from Three Houses. However, if I had to choose my favorite assassin, it's Jafar. I mean, the guy is called the Angel of Death for a reason. He is extremely serious, just a man of few words. He just shows up like a shadow in the night, and the first time you see him in action is basically when he more or less killed Layla where he ended up killing Layla on Nurgle's orders. On Nurgle's orders. And oh man, that moment is just, you're just realizing this and you're like, oh, I do not want to mess with this guy. I mean, granted, it also did serve as a sort of turning point, but it also showed a bit of Matthew's personality as well, considering he did care for Layla. And even with that, when you finally got him on your squad, he becomes basically your secret weapon. And take it from someone who has used him a fair amount of times. Just, the guy is God tier. Let's be clear about that. He is God tier. Moving on next at number 5, we have Paladin. Oh boy. The classic of the classic Fire Emblem classes. And when you think about any class that has shown up since the beginning, it always has to be the Cavalier class. And that being said, Cavaliers and Paladin are basically the bread and butter of the franchise. You have those, they're always going to show up in the games, and they're always going to be your main standby. Naturally, due to being mounted, not only mounted units, because they tend to essentially, meaning they're able to get quite further than your other opponent, but they have a bit of, I guess I'd say, kind of balanced stat spread, with one, more often than not, with a pair of Cavaliers in red and green armor, with differing stat spreads depending on the color of the armor, with red armor Cavaliers being, with the Cavaliers in red armor having more strength, and the Cavaliers in green armor having more defense, But even with that, like something, like bow units or grapplers, like bow knights or grapplers, I will tend to have at least one paladin on my team, Cavalier or Paladin on my team, whenever I play through Fire Emblem. And naturally, that's because a lot of Fire Emblem Paladins, a lot of them have some amazing personalities that honestly just kind of win me over. In fact, I've had it was pretty hard to find my favorite paladin out of everyone. And legit, there are a lot of them that are my favorites. You got characters like Sully, Kieran, Sophie, Perry, Ferdinand, Sylvain, Kent, Sane, Alan, Lance, Alec, Noish, Franz, Ford, Oscar, Kyle. You have a lot of them. However, yeah, it's kind of obvious that I think we all know what my favorite paladin is. It's Seth. Reason? No reason. He's a man among men. Let's just be real. And yes, I am Seth-pilled. But can you even blame me? I mean, Sacred Stones is said to be one of the easiest Fire Emblem titles. And it's because Seth is so, he is so amazing to the point that he could stand tall no matter what. I mean, he could easily solo the game. That being said, I do tend to, use Seth initially, but then I don't. But yeah, more often than not, whenever I play Sacred Stones, I am tempted to use Seth. And that's really saying a lot. Oh yeah, I forgot Noah and Lowen. Oh boy. And Clive. Yeah, I still find Seth to be my favorite, but I forgot to mention Noah, Lowen, and Clive. Yeah. Moving on next at number 4, we have Falcon Knight. Yeah. As much as we've had mounted units and paladins, we have had flyers in the Fire Emblem franchise. And honestly, it was kind of hard deciding my favorite of the 2 flying units, whether it's Falcon Knights or Wyvern Riders. And while I would essentially consider Wyvern Riders, yeah, Falcon Knights really stood out to me. But that being said, I don't hate Wyvern Riders, but consider the Wyvern Rider class to be an honorary number 11. That being said, honestly, Falcon Knights have had so much variability and involving battle that you really get a chance to choose your style. I mean, granted, while they do start off by being able to utilize hit and run attacks, being pure lance units, they eventually gain much more versatility as time goes on. And eventually, when they become Falcon Knights, they gain access to swords in the early Fire Emblem titles, or staves in the more modern titles like Fates and Awakening. And they have enough versatility to make use of their strategy, to make use of different strategies, like no matter what game they're in. And in all fairness, I've had a fair amount of my favorite units being flyers, which really says a lot. As you have even with that, I've had a few of my favorites have been the likes of Sheeta from the Arcanea duology, Claire from Echoes, Marcia from the Teleus duology, Chloe from Engage, Ingrid from Three Houses, and Tana from Sacred Stones. However, honestly, and I had to sleep on this one, but my favorite Falcon Knight is, without the shadow of a doubt, Florina. Yeah. Here's the thing. It was between Florina and Sumia for my favorite Falcon Knight. And that's really because Sumia has been one of the few units I've been able to max out no matter what whenever I've played through Fire Emblem Awakening. And she has more or less proved to be one of my strongest units, depending on my playthrough of Awakening. So, yeah. I really had a... However, that being... Yeah, I really had that in the bag. However, considering how I was introduced with Blazing Sword, I had to choose Florina. And not only is she one of the most adorable characters from Blazing Sword, but honestly, even with that adorability, she proves to be a veritable powerhouse. And I basically revisited Blazing Sword in recent years. And Florina served me well multiple times. I mean, she's even... The fact she's given Sumia a run for her money is saying a lot. And even with that, the adorability really just doesn't stand with just her battle prowess. But but her personality in the games where she's basically anxious about things and is dealing with her fear of men really endears her to me as an individual. And honestly, she's still learning, and over time, when you eventually get into the Eliwood mode, she eventually becomes much more confident to essentially warn Eliwood and Hector about the enemy taking over Castle Kaelin. And honestly, it's really a nice little bit of character development for her. I mean, even though she does land on Hector to the point that she's scared of him because of that, really says a lot. And even with that, her supports with her sisters are both kind of interesting. With her sister Fiora just more or less worrying about her, considering how anxious she gets around other people, and her sister Farna willing to tease her about her demeanor, and especially even mentioning an embarrassing moment where she got drunk and sat cross-legged on a table singing a song about Pegasi, which is really saying a lot. Also, Farna's one to talk, considering how you have to... Nope, that's for another time. Either way, yeah. Florina Supremacy for the win. Moving on next at number 3, we have the Sage class. Yeah, this is where my nerd colors shine through. I mean, I'm a simple nerd. I kinda, more often than not, what comes to mind is just brains over brawn. And mainly because I am scrawny. But that being said, honestly, in fairness, the Sage class definitely proves that. And I've been a Magic fan for a good amount of my life. I mean, I'm a big fan of Harry Potter. I like anime like Fairy Tail or Black Clover, Rising of the Shield Hero. And honestly, in fairness, anything involving magic is my bread and butter. I mean, that being said, I will always go for the Sage classes, since they're more or less, and since I'll go for magical power over physical power. And that really says a lot when you realize what's coming up later on. But even with that, in almost every playthrough of a different Fire Emblem game, I have a lot of magical units I will more or less use. And I've always had to use one magic unit, like one Sage. Problem is, I really didn't know which to choose, as I could have chosen a Bishop or a Valkyrie for this list, hence why I was considering characters like Lucius, Mist, Elise, or like Lucius, Mist, Elise, or Silk. Like Lucius, Mist, Elise, Silk, and Artur. Or even Magic Knight characters like Lute or Larachelle. Or even just your standard mages like Rickon, Annette, Citrine, Clan, Sorin, or Eric. Or even May, for that matter. Yeah, really does say a lot. But I had a lot of mages to choose. That being said, my favorite sages, it's either one of two, depending on whether you consider them to be sages. The first one is Linde from the Arcanea duology, and I recently got a chance to play through Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the DS and New Mystery of the Emblem for the DS, both on emulation, and honestly, I've been drawn towards a lot of characters from those games. And honestly, one character that I've been drawn to is Linde, and to the point that I guess you'd say that I might have a little crush on her. But even with that, I've tended to make you. Linde was one of my units when facing off against that I used facing off against Medius at the end of Shadow Dragon. And even in New Mystery of the Emblem, she's one of the units I have trained up fully, which really says a lot. However, if you don't count Linde as your standard sage, I'd have to go with Lysithea from Three Houses. And again, that's because this kid is a magical nuke. Yeah. She is 14 years old, and she is a magical prodigy. However, she does not want to be seen as a child. Which, again, the fact that she shares the same personality with Hayato from Fire Emblem Fates, yet is loved by the fandom, is really confusing me, to say the least. But even with that, I've played through Three Houses like 10 times. Honestly, something is going right for me to find a way to use Lysithea in a good amount of my playthroughs. I mean, heck, even with his most efforts where I've basically faced off against the Death Knight, I've brought Lysithea into the fray because of Dark Spikes. Yeah. I mean, it's basic, I know, but honestly, it depends on which one most Fire Emblem fans would consider a standard sage. Either Linde or Lysithea. But yeah, definitely fits. Moving on next at number 2, we have the Sniper. You guys know me. I am a sucker for bow units. Or any unit that utilizes a bow in battle. I mean, heck, when I made top 10 archers in video games, I was really enjoying it. And my top 10 archers in video games countdown, I was really enjoying it. Which really says a lot considering I was really knowledgeable with that one. But that being said, archers in Fire Emblem really did not start off as good as they are at recent. And that's because they were basically just ranged units that really didn't take that much attack. I mean, granted, more often than not, you're able to dodge an attack, but if you took an attack, you really couldn't do so for beans. Which really says a lot. However, that being said, it wasn't until Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn when archers and snipers were finally given the respect they were owed. Not only gaining access to crossbows, which honestly made them able to attack close up, but they were given more and more perks from water walking in Fates, which is only seen in Takumi, to being able to attack from up to 3 spaces away in echoes, or at least more with a skill like curve shot or with a skill like curve shot or break shot. And they've had some solid skills that really tend to turn the tide when you need it. And honestly, even with that, it's basically been able to allow me to rediscover my love for the bow. That being said, makes you wonder what my favorite archer or sniper would be. And honestly, I have a few units that tend to come to mind. These include the aforementioned Takumi from Fates, Bernadetta from Three Houses, both Alchrist and Etier from Engage, Rolf from Path of Radiance, Namie from Sacred Stones, and even Gordon, aka Mr. 5 Points, from the Arcanea duology. But in all fairness, I gotta go with Blazing Sword because my favorite just so happens to be Rebecca from Blazing Sword. And honestly, when you think about it, she is one of my favorite units. Basically, just ever since I played through Blazing Sword for the first time growing up, like when I was like early high school, I was interested in wanting to play through more Blazing Swords, so I was able to jailbreak my iPod Touch in order to play through GBA video games. And one of them was Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, which allowed me to understand the power of the Archer class. And I was drawn to Rebecca as one of my favorites. And she's not only one of my favorites, being a plucky village girl with a drive to become more than she wants, as well as her entire storyline to search for her brother Dan, who just so happens to be the pirate Dart. And it's really enjoyable. And considering how the only other archer many of us have utilized in Blazing Sword was Will, yeah, Rebecca just leaves Will behind in the dust. And honestly, I'm all for it. It is just so amazing. Plus, there's her support with Lowen and Rebecca, which is there's her support with Lowen, which is one of the sweetest, since she basically sees him as a knight, which kind of really does say a lot, and it fits that nice little relationship that they have with each other. Almost kind of romantic, to say the least. I mean, granted, she may be romanticizing about knights, and Lois is saying, come on, I'm not that valiant. But it really does say a lot. Especially when you consider Binding Blade gave us Rebecca's son, Walt, who is... Yeah, the fact that Walt is basically not only Roy's childhood friend, but his noble retainer. Yeah, it's honest that it's very fair to say that Rebecca and Lowen ended up getting together and getting busy. Yeah. And yes, I ship Rebecca and Lowen together. I ship them like FedEx. That being said, moving on to number 1, we have the Swordmaster. Honestly, I know it's kind of fair to say that most people would think I put the Sniper at number 1 or the Sage at number 1. But no, honestly, surprisingly enough, younger me would have put Sniper or Sage at number 1. However, I've gained a new respect for the Swordmaster class, and coincidentally, the likes of the Mermaiden and samurai classes. And actually, that's because not only are they fast, but they are strong as well. To the point that they have a high DPS, that is damage per second, where they can more or less do multiple hits to an opponent without even blinking an eye. I mean, and that's really saying a lot, as, yeah, you would think I would have studied the blade, but honestly, while I wouldn't, I tend to use these more than enough. And that being said, DPS per second, the DPS per second really says a lot, considering the Astra skill has always been linked with Swordmasters. And that's the reason why Swordmasters are so good in my opinion. It's Astra that just gives them that staying power that allows them to rack up a good amount of damage every time they're put into battle. Even when Astra doesn't show up, yeah, they hit hard. That being said, it's kind of hard to figure out which one are my favorite Swordmasters. As again, we've had several interesting characters, including Aira from Genealogy of the Holy War, and of course Larce, Joshua from Sacred Stones, who is a solid character within that game, especially due to being a wandering prince and a stalwart gambler. Guy, due to my current playthrough of Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, where I'm playing through Hector normal mode as Hana from Fire Emblem Fates. The aforementioned Hana from Fates, who is my Fates waifu, as well as Ryoma, who is just completely and utterly broken. And even Lapis from Engage, who is just best girl. However, I have to choose Felix. Yeah, my favorite is Felix. And as someone on the autism spectrum, I tend to essentially gravitate towards characters that are kind of like me. And this is definitely the case with Felix. Granted, not only is he focused on sparring and honing his craft with the blade, but he's often shown to be fairly blunt with those he knows. Or basically, those around him, those he interacts with. And basically, this is a case of the older Fire Emblem Swordmasters like Rutger, Navarre, or Shiva, who all tend to fit that entire archetype. And that being said, Felix is still pretty strong and even further fits due to his singular personal skill of Lone Wolf, which ups his crit chance, or ups his skill by a considerable amount when he's not paired with a battalion. And more often than not, every time I play through Three Houses, I'd always make it a point to recruit Felix as one of those units. And it really says a lot. Plus, you gotta admit, his support within it is just kind of adorable. So, yeah. That being said, Felix is just my favorite swordmaster. And in fairness, those are all my top 10 favorite Fire Emblem classes. Like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, if you want to join my Patreon, you can do so by going on to patreon.com/theautisticscyther. Granted, don't pay for a tier if you can't afford it. Just take care of yourself. But if you want to join my Patreon and support me, just join the free tier. It's there for a reason. Just, if you want to support me, choose the free tier and take care of yourself. That being said, without further ado, I'll see you next time for something a little more musical.